Good evening, my friends. Before we begin, take a breath. Look around you, the light on your screen, the quiet hum of electricity, the pulse of the world still beating in wires and cables. Now imagine it gone, because tonight, I'm taking you to a city where the light vanished, not by accident, but by design. It began on a warm November night in 2025. Bamako, the heart of Mali, stood beneath a velvet sky. Street vendors folded up their tables, radios whispered music through thin static. The city exhaled, and then silence. Block by block, the lights blinked out. Hospitals went dark mid-surgery. Generators coughed once, twice, then died. In a maternity ward, a nurse waved a piece of cardboard over a newborn struggling for air. Mothers whispered prayers in the dark. To the rest of the world, it was a line of text on a distant ticker. Power outage in Mali's capital. But inside Bamako, it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. Hours passed. Then days. And still, no hum of engines, no buzz of life. At first, people thought it was just another blackout, the kind every city in the Sahel endures and forgets. But by the third day, when the last fuel truck failed to arrive, everyone knew this was different. The roads were cut. Convoys disappeared. Gas stations emptied before noon. Taxi drivers pushed their cars into the shadows and walked home. And soon, whispers spread faster than light ever could. This wasn't an accident. This was a siege. An Al-Qaeda-linked faction calling itself JNIM had found a new kind of weapon. Not bombs, not drones, but fuel. They choked the arteries that kept a nation alive. Every blocked road, every hijacked convoy, every silent generator, another wound in Mali's body. Hospitals rationed oxygen, food spoiled in the heat. The air grew heavy with dust and fear. A liter of gasoline that once cost 700 CFA now cost more than a family's daily meal. Batteries became currency. Candles became gold. Children cried not from hunger, but from the stillness, the absence of sound. The city that once sang now whispered. Foreign embassies sent out alerts. France, the United States, and Britain urged their citizens to flee. Newspapers printed the same familiar words, Mali on the brink. But behind the panic, something else was forming, something harder to define, yet impossible to ignore. The world saw collapse. The people of Mali saw defiance, because even as the lights failed, small sparks of resilience began to glow. Mechanics gathered in back alley workshops, converting engines to run on ethanol and animal fat. Farmers pooled their last liters of diesel to keep local clinics alive. Old men stood guard at fuel depots through the night. Women cooked by firelight and shared what little they had with their neighbors. If they want to starve us, one man said, his voice steady in the dark, then we'll learn to feed ourselves in silence. The blackout had turned fear into fuel, and hundreds of kilometers away, in Ouagadougou, another man was watching. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, recognized what was unfolding. This was more than a crisis, it was a message to the entire Sahel. If one capital could be strangled, all could be. He called for coordination, for unity, for an alliance that would no longer depend on distant capitals to defend African soil. And from that call was born the Alliance of Sahel States. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso standing together under one banner, AES. Their first mission had no name at first. Later, they would call it Operation Sovereignty. The order was simple but dangerous. Reopen the roads. Bring back the light. At dawn, a column of 40 fuel trucks rolled out from Niamey, escorted by soldiers from all three nations. Drones circled overhead. The desert wind carried a prayer in every direction. Villagers lined the roadsides, waving flags, whispering blessings. They knew what those trucks carried wasn't just diesel. It was hope. Halfway to Gao, the first blast struck. A roadside bomb tore open the front vehicle, flames licking the sand. For a moment, everything froze. Smoke, screams, dust. Then, the AES troops moved. Swift, silent, precise. They pushed through the ambush, drones tracing the militants' retreat through the scrubland. Within minutes, the road was clear again, and the convoy rolled on. When the first truck reached Gao, the crowd erupted. People shouted through tears, "Lumière revient." The light is coming back. Children ran beside the trucks. Old men raised their hands to the sun. For the first time in weeks, the scent of fuel filled the air. The smell of life returning. It wasn't just about electricity. It was about proof. Proof that the Sahel could defend itself. Proof that sovereignty wasn't a slogan. It was a pulse, beating in the dust and diesel of a people who refused to disappear. But the world barely noticed. Foreign outlets continued to call it chaos, a symptom of collapse. They saw desperation, not determination. They heard gunfire, not resolve. And in that silence, another battle was being fought. A war of perception. When the world stops listening, your victories become invisible. So Mali spoke louder, not with microphones, but with movement. Colonel Assimi Goïta, Mali's leader, appeared on state radio for the first time since the blackout began. His words were measured, deliberate. They tried to starve our cities. They tried to break our spirit. They failed. We will not surrender our sovereignty not to terrorists, and not to those who treat us as children. Across the border, Captain Traoré echoed him before a crowd of soldiers and farmers. Our sovereignty will not be subcontracted again. Those words traveled faster than any convoy, from radios in Gao to classrooms in Niamey, from the deserts of Timbuktu to the ports of Casablanca. For the first time in decades, a new kind of map was being drawn. Not of borders, but of belief. In cafes, people spoke of energy independence, Sahelian corridors, African logistics. Ideas that once belonged to economists now belonged to everyone. Who controls the roads, one teacher said, controls the story. The blackout had turned into a lesson, a harsh but necessary one. Because sovereignty isn't a flag or an anthem. It's control over your own lifelines, the fuel, the food, the light. And in the shadows of that realization, a movement was born. Weeks passed. Bamako's lights flickered back to life. Hospitals restarted machines that had been silent for 20 days. Street musicians tuned their guitars again. Children chased their shadows beneath humming lamps. There were no parades, no fireworks. Just quiet relief, a long breath released after weeks of holding it in. But something had changed. The people no longer waited for orders from above. They had built systems of their own. Neighborhood committees guarded local fuel reserves. Electricians rewired broken grids. Engineers, unpaid, sleepless, kept power stations alive with scrap parts. For the first time in living memory, Malians didn't wait for rescue. They rescued themselves. Across the region, the same spirit spread. In Niger, young officers coordinated joint patrols. In Burkina Faso, engineers drew lines on maps for a new trade artery, a trans-Sahelian corridor that would link their landlocked heart to the Atlantic, bypassing the fragile coastal routes once controlled by foreign ports. The plan was ambitious. Critics called it impossible. But to those who had lived through the blackout, impossibility had lost its meaning. They had already survived the dark. Western capitals reacted uneasily. France called it regional militarization. The United States warned of Russian influence. Analysts on television spoke of strongmen and fragile democracies. But in the streets of Bamako, those words felt like static from another world. People weren't thinking about geopolitics. They were thinking about keeping the lights on, the water flowing, the bread baking. For them, freedom wasn't theoretical. It was practical. It was the hum of a generator at midnight, the glow of a bulb above a child's homework, the quiet dignity of endurance. As 2025 drew to a close, the scars of the blackout were still visible. Burnt transformers, charred fuel trucks, darkened billboards. But beneath those scars, something was growing. Inside the new AES command center in Niamey, maps covered the walls, red lines tracing the arteries of the Sahel, each once choked by war, now protected by joint patrols and drones. Young officers, some barely 20, worked beside engineers and farmers, united by a single oath: no city in the Sahel will go dark again. The insurgency had not vanished. JNIM still lurked in the shadows, striking at convoys and villages. But fear had changed sides. The militants could still plant bombs. They could no longer plant doubt. And perhaps that was the greatest victory. Not the return of light, but the return of belief. Belief that Africa's survival need not be managed from abroad. Belief that sovereignty, once reclaimed, could be sustained. The West saw chaos. The Sahel saw awakening. What the world labeled collapse was, in truth, rebirth. Good evening once more, my friends. As we reach the end of this journey, remember where we began in darkness. November 2025 will be remembered not only for the blackout that silenced Bamako, but for the moment when silence itself became resistance. The militants thought they could make a nation kneel. Instead, it stood taller. And when the first engines roared back to life, it wasn't just electricity returning. It was hope. And hope, once awakened, does not go quietly. In the weeks that followed, the headlines faded, as they always do. The world went back to its comfort, its screens, its noise, its light. But somewhere in the Sahel, a convoy still rumbles through the desert, headlights cutting through the dark like promises. Because sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it drives a fuel truck through mined roads with no guarantee of arrival. Sometimes it delivers light to a city that the world forgot. That is the story of Bamako, a city that refused to surrender to silence. So tonight, I leave you with a question. If your city went dark for 7 days, no fuel, no transport, no power, what would break first? Your patience? Your order? Or your faith in those meant to protect you? Because what happened in Bamako isn't just Mali's story. It's a mirror. When the next blackout comes, not in the Sahel, but perhaps in your own streets, will your nation endure as Mali did? Or will it crumble beneath its own dependence? The world may never have expected light to return to Bamako, but it did. And with it came a message whispered across continents. Sovereignty isn't given, it's earned. And the Sahel has just begun.